The Space Between Cups, a tale of quiet betrayal, fading footsteps, and the garden that grew from silence. I didn't notice the silence at first. It came gradually, folded into the corners of our days. A small pause between words, a door closed a little too gently, footsteps that no longer matched mine. The house stayed the same. The rooms remained tidy, the bed was always made. There were 2 cups on the counter every morning, one for him and one for me. The routine continued without interruption. That's the thing about distance. It doesn't always come with a sound. It comes with space. Empty space. And once it arrives, it stays. I began waking up before the sun, sitting in the living room without turning on the lights. I liked the way the dark softened the edges of things. The bookshelves blurred into the walls. The frames on the mantel became shadows. In the quiet, I could almost believe everything was still intact. He still came home every evening, still placed his phone face down on the table, still smiled in that small, practiced way. I didn't ask where he had been. I had stopped asking questions long before I had answers. My sister visited often, too often. She would come with bags of fruit, small boxes of pastries, and stories that filled the room more than her presence did. Her voice was light, her laugh unchanged. I watched her from across the room, noticing the way her eyes moved when he entered and how her shoulders shifted just slightly in his direction. It was nothing obvious, just enough to feel off, like something had tilted, and I couldn't tell if it was the floor or my perception. I told myself it was grief, that I was seeing things through a lens shaped by old loss. After our mother passed, my sister had clung to me like a shadow. I never questioned it. Family is supposed to hold close, especially when things fall apart. But sometimes, when she stayed longer than usual, when her jacket hung near his in the entryway, when I heard her humming in the kitchen like she lived here, I felt a shift in my chest. A dull weight that settled and refused to leave. It wasn't a single moment that changed everything. It was the slow buildup of things left unsaid. The missing gestures, the looks exchanged when they thought I wasn't watching. And maybe I wasn't. Not really. Maybe I had grown too used to being in the background, assuming love would hold on its own, without needing to be seen or named. One morning, I found a strand of hair on his scarf. It wasn't mine. I held it between my fingers and stared at it for a long time. There was no anger, just a quiet recognition. Something that had been waiting in the shadows had finally stepped into the light. I didn't confront either of them. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been answered in their silence. The house was already full of words unspoken. Adding more wouldn't change anything. Instead, I returned to the garden. I dug into the soil with bare hands and planted seeds without knowing if they would grow. The act of planting felt like control, something simple, something of mine. The dirt was cold and real, unlike the air inside the house, which had grown too still. I stopped setting the table for 3. I began sleeping on the far side of the bed, away from the warmth that no longer reached me. I started taking walks in the early morning, when the streets were empty and the light hadn't yet decided what kind of day it would be. Sometimes I passed couples walking together, their bodies leaning slightly toward each other. I didn't feel envy, just a quiet awareness that I no longer belonged in that kind of closeness. My sister's visits became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. He didn't mention her absence. I didn't ask. Whatever had existed between them had played out behind doors I was never meant to open. I didn't want to look inside. I noticed he stayed out later. When he came home, he moved around the house like a guest. Polite, distant, as if we were sharing a space rather than a life. I began to wonder if we had ever really shared anything at all, or if we had both just filled the roles we were given. One evening, I sat in the room we used to call the heart of the house. It was where we used to gather after dinner, where we kept the softest blankets and the books we never finished. I stared at the space where my sister used to sit, legs curled under her voice filling the space with stories from her day. I thought about how easily comfort can become routine, and how routine can cover things we don't want to see. There was a photograph on the wall of me, him, and her, taken during a trip to the coast. We looked happy, not just smiling for the camera, but caught in a moment of real warmth. I stared at that image for a long time, wondering if what I remembered was true or just what I wanted to believe. I took the photo down, not out of anger, just a quiet need to let go of something that no longer felt honest. That night, I didn't wait for him to come home. I went to bed early, the window cracked open, letting in the sound of wind moving through the trees. The bed felt colder than usual, but also clearer, like something had finally settled. Over the next few weeks, I began rearranging the house. I moved furniture, packed away old dishes, and boxed up things that no longer felt like mine. I painted the walls in lighter shades, ones that caught the morning light. I opened windows I had kept closed for years. The air shifted. So did I. I didn't tell him I was changing things. He didn't ask. He noticed, of course. But he said nothing. We had become two people, living parallel lives, moving past each other like strangers in a train station. Eventually he left, not with an announcement, just a quiet exit. A packed bag, a closed door, a final silence. I stood in the hallway after the door clicked shut. I felt no relief, no sorrow, just a stillness that wasn't heavy anymore. I stood there for a long time, listening to nothing. In the weeks that followed, I began waking with ease. I spent more time outside, tending to the garden, watching the slow progress of green shoots breaking through the earth. The days passed without needing to be filled. I no longer searched for meaning in small things. I simply noticed them. The sound of rain on the windows, the way sunlight moved across the floor, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator at night. The air inside the house no longer pressed down on my chest. I no longer looked for shadows in corners. Evenings became softer. Mornings became whole. I kept the room where the photo once hung empty for a while. I let the walls breathe. I swept the floor often, not because it needed cleaning, but because I liked the ritual of it. The repetition, the stillness, the quiet. Then one day I filled it with plants. I brought in ferns, succulents, and a tall rubber tree that leaned toward the light like it knew something I didn't. I set up a small reading chair near the window. The walls, once adorned with memories that no longer felt like mine, were now blank. Ready. It no longer felt like a room where things ended. It became a space where things could begin again, even if I didn't yet know what those things would be. I took long walks to the flower market on weekends. I didn't buy much, but I liked being surrounded by life in full bloom. I learned the names of things I had never paid attention to before: hellebore, celosia, and yarrow. I admired their fragility, their defiance. Some days I thought about them, not with bitterness, just curiosity, wondering where they were, how they'd shaped their days, and whether they ever spoke of me. But those thoughts passed like clouds over a still lake. They didn't linger. They didn't change anything. I let go of the idea of resolution. I realized I didn't need answers to move forward. The reasons for their silence, their choices, their betrayal, none of it mattered now. What mattered was the space they left behind and what I chose to do with it. The garden thrived. I planted things without reading the instructions. I let intuition guide me to bury this here, water this sparingly, and give this one sunlight in the afternoon. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but I kept planting. In early spring, the first sprouts broke through the soil like small, hopeful declarations. I sat beside them in the mornings, watching their quiet effort to live. There was something sacred about their persistence. The room with no light had become a quiet corner of the house, not forgotten, but no longer painful. It held the shape of what once was and the echo of what I survived. I stopped measuring time by their absence. I no longer marked the days by who hadn't called or who hadn't stayed. I marked them by the sound of birds at dawn, the scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen, and the feel of cool tiles under my feet. I redefined the rituals. I started baking again. Small things: bread, almond cake, ginger cookies. The oven warmed the kitchen in ways words never could. I played old records. I danced when no one was watching. I smiled without reason. I began writing letters I never sent. I wrote to my mother, telling her how much of her lived in the garden. I wrote to my younger self, apologizing for all the times I had disappeared inside silence. I wrote to the woman I was becoming, welcoming her back. I no longer avoided mirrors. I looked directly, unflinching, not to search for what had changed, but to see what remained. In the stillness of my evenings, I read poetry aloud to no one in particular. I let the words fill the room. I watched how they settled on the windowsills and drifted along the floor like petals. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by. She brought lemons from her tree and asked if I was alone. I said yes, but I didn't feel it in the way I used to. It didn't carry weight. It just was. The seasons turned quietly. I watched the trees shed and regrow and watched the sky change its mind 1,000 times. The world didn't owe me healing. But somehow, it gave it to me anyway in soft increments, in scattered moments, in the spaces where pain used to live. I never spoke to my sister again. Her number faded from memory like a dream you try to hold on to after waking. I didn't need closure. I didn't need revenge. I needed air, and I finally had it. Now when I walk through the house, I feel its heartbeat again. Not from shared laughter or clinking glasses or echoing footsteps, but from my own breath, steady and whole. And in the garden outside, something is always growing.